You're watching the John Wood Jr. Show. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And I'm joined by the one and only artist. Pardon me, artist. Goodness gracious! Well, John, you are an artist, though, John. I don't think that's
kind of, but not
an exaggeration. An artist of the intellect and of language, I think, and polemics to be sure, but author, commentator, and in particular the author of a book that we will be discussing here entitled "Woke Racism." Making the point that the activist culture of today's woke is really sort of a religious phenomenon, if I understand the argument correctly. And I think that there's some deep places that we can go with that line of commentary. John McWhorter, welcome to the John Wood Jr. Show, my friend.
Thank you, John. Good to see you.
Absolutely. So let's jump into it. What is the argument that you make in woke racism, and what distinguishes it perhaps from other ways people have of analyzing or criticizing the phenomenon of wokeness?
What our problem is two things. The book is about two things. One is to show, and this is by no means the whole book, it's just one chapter, but one is to show that there's a certain kind of woke person out there who has become religious. It's not a political philosophy, it's a religious creed. And the reason that's important to distinguish is because there's a point beyond which you can't reason with these people. It's no longer about what works, what matters, what helps people. It's about showing that you're a good person by showing that you know that racism exists. And that's really all. And so as long as you're showing that racism exists, it doesn't matter if even you're hurting Black people in the process. So that's the first part. The second part of the book, and most of it, is showing that the problem with this religion is, because I think some of the people in the right mood would say, okay, it is a religion, I own it, and what's wrong with that? The problem with it is that this particular strain of punitive prosecutorial wokeness hurts not only the white people who get hounded out of jobs because they use a word wrong, but it hurts Black people. These people are supposedly fighting for us, but really they have very little concern with what the actual effect on Black communities will be with their ideology that's based on showing that they are not racist in order to be prepared for the great coming to terms at the end of their lives when they're going to go live in the grace of the anti-racist God. And so I think that we really need to question the extremes of this ideology. That's what woke racism is about.
Okay. Now that leads me to want to pursue a few different threads. It's hard to pursue multiple threads simultaneously, of course. I guess the first one I'll put on the table is it not the case that we live in a highly polarized ideological age, generally speaking, that you have folks who will, the religious analogy is often used to describe supporters of President Trump, for instance. They'll say that, people have found a religious icon in Trump. People made similar claims from the right about folks' devotion to Barack Obama, but we've got the sense that ideology has a way of just seizing people. Is wokeism fundamentally different from the ways in which people just sort of put on an ideological hat and say, this is my tribe, this is my group, right or wrong, and I'm going to defend to the bone what it is my side says without critically reflecting upon it? What makes wokeism different from the ideological fervor that's sort of existed across the political spectrum for a while now?
Well, the difference between this wokeness, which I call a religion, and just ideology is the idea among these people that if you don't agree with them, you have to be chased into the public square and beaten. That's where you see that there's an irrational aspect to this. And so it's not only we believe that the world goes this way, and we're going to fight for that, and we're going to look past any flaws in the ideology. It's also that if you're not with us, then you deserve to be shamed, you deserve to lose your job. And for that, we think about ideologies that also essentially were religions, such as high Stalinism and what happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. Here, we're not seeing people physically abused, but the general principle, which is that you deserve to lose your job and to never be able to walk with your head high again in polite society if you use the wrong word, if you show the wrong clip of a film, if you are not striking the same postures they strike. There is an aspect of that that's fanatical. And yet the people in question are not crazy. They're not out of control. It's just that this is religious thought. And I'm not saying that religion is all bad. I'm saying that religion often has a component where you're supposed to suspend your rationality and just have faith. That aspect of this particular religion leads to a lot of people being needlessly hurt and neglected. And so therefore, as I've often said, if I may, the issue here is not necessarily that it's a religion, it's that it's a shitty religion, and we need to confront it as that.
So there is a substantive point, I think, that is nestled within sort of this larger perspective that we're referring to as wokeism, which, you know, may seek to sort of give some grounding to this impulse that you're describing, to sort of run roughshod over some of the norms of dialogue and dialectic to sort of cancel people, perhaps for their particular points of view. And what I hear people saying within the woke, you know, to just use the term within the woke spaces here, is that there's a way in which these sort of traditional liberal norms of American society actually serve to buttress a larger overarching sort of white supremacist kind of framework within which Western society generally and American society in particular tends to exist. And I see this analysis being pointed at very broad phenomena in some sense, that, you know, on the one hand, you know, the norms of civility keep us from calling out the institutional racism that protects, let's say, you know, the mythos of law enforcement in a way that keeps us from acknowledging the rampaging abuse of young Black people at the hands of police officers, to more narrow sorts of context wherein, okay, I'm in a classroom or I'm in a boardroom, I have a certain dialect, I have a certain way of dressing, and my cultural identity is muted by a status quo that says, oh, you have to speak, you know, you have to speak the King's English, you have to speak this way. But in the process of that, I'm being erased. Isn't there some larger sort of cultural and social analysis contained within this sort of social justice oriented sort of worldview that perhaps you're sort of minimizing or disregarding a bit by just lumping it all into the catch-all bucket of an irrational religion?
I hear you. That's a very incisive question. And I would say that the answer is no. I would say that what's going on with these people is a radical kind of idealism. I completely understand where they're coming from. This world where you can walk into a boardroom and talk how you want and discourse the way you want. That's not really a word. You can dress the way you want, whatever. And people have to allow you your individuality. You don't have to conform. I get that. I can see how that would be attractive, but that's idealist. That's radical. That's not the way any human society has ever operated. That's a radical idea. And you can say that about a great number of things that this kind of person wants to call for. And my complaint is simply that because this is such a radical and idealist way of looking at things, where do you come off imposing it by throwing people out of windows and shaming them? And where they come off is that they think they've got the answer to everything. They think that this is different. Stalin was one thing, Mao was one thing, but something called social justice, their version of it, how could you possibly be against it? But let's face it, if you think historically, there have been a great many people in this world who thought they found the answer to everything. They were almost always wrong. And so we have to look at these people as seized by something and under an understandable but mistaken impression that they found the answer to everything, and that therefore it is okay to hurt people with the goal of fashioning society in their way. And there's a very simple question you have to ask people like this. What is the evidence that your way of doing things would be better? Point to something that you have built that's better. So a perfect example of this, and I don't mean to get ad hominem, but it's really useful. Robin DiAngelo writes White Fragility. White Fragility is a book all about how white people need to sit with their hands on their thighs and look inward and identify subtle aspects of racism within them and understand that they, in a very abstract analysis, are complicit within racism every time they get out of bed or open their mouths. Okay, that is a very radical an idealist way of looking at things. Maybe that's the solution to humankind's problems, but I can just venture that maybe it isn't. Now, the question that you want to ask somebody like that, and they don't have an answer, is, and in her case, it's useful. She's been doing workshops promulgating this kind of view for decades. You might want to ask her, what has it accomplished? What are your results? She'll often say in interviews, well, if anybody doesn't agree with me, including Black people like you and me, well, I'm going to ask them, what have you done? I've been doing this for decades. What do you have to match it? Well, what does she have to show? Because even from her book, you get the feeling that she spent decades making people cry in boardrooms. What's the result? So that is my answer to those questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read White Fragility cover to cover.
Bad.
And it is an important book to read, I think.
It is.
Just to get some perspective on the geography of, the thinking that you're illustrating. And of course, at Braver Angels, I mean, we work in intervention, we work brokering dialogue and collaboration across political and cultural divides, adjacent to the sorts of programs that she works with in diversity, equity, inclusion work. But it is remarkable to read that book and to note there's not a single success story that is recounted across that book in terms of someone sort of genuinely seeming to change their mind. Now, having said that, I certainly talk to people in the DEI space who will tell me, hey, this is not all white fragility, Robin DiAngelo. There are some people who, yes, will grade their effectiveness in DEI workshop facilitation according to the number of white tears that are shed, but that doesn't necessarily describe all of us who are in this space. To what degree are you identifying a sort of perhaps a fringe or a wing within a larger movement that, as we very well know, in the context of our modern polarized sort of culture wars, the wings can easily come to define everybody, in the mainstream of a given side, two people on the other side. So that's always a danger. To what degree are you describing a fringe and a wing versus describing the actual sort of dead center of this modern sort of social justice movement, which I think is being largely sort of painted with this brush by critics?
It is very much a fringe. It's not the way most people think, but it is choking our academic, our intellectual, and our artistic life. I've never seen anything like it. And the reason that this fringe has such disproportionate influence is because everybody's afraid of these people. These people have something called Twitter that they can use to get what they want. I don't think they're doing it consciously, but if you don't do what they say, they call you a racist on Twitter. And then they have a whole bunch of other people call you a racist on Twitter. One of the nice things about our times is that most people don't want to be racist and therefore don't want to be called racist. But there's an unpleasant byproduct, which is that most people feel like they've been outed as a pedophile to be called a racist. And so many people will avoid being called that, even if it means pretending views that they don't believe, adopting policies that they don't think help Black people. And so, yes, this is a fringe. Part of the reason I'm writing this book is because I can tell that most people left of center don't agree with this stuff. Certainly the Fox News crowd doesn't, but I don't feel alone. I feel like most people in my world, which is the NPR, New Yorker, New York Times reading world, don't like this stuff. But there is a fringe of people who everybody curtsies to because they don't want to get called names. I am urging intelligent Americans who understand that radical idealism is not the answer to everything to start growing some thicker skin and to get used to being called racist by a certain kind of person and standing up and dusting yourself off and walking on and doing what you were going to do anyway. That's not something that the very modern American is used to. If somebody calls you a racist, you're supposed to go jump off a cliff. No, we have to get used to being called racist by a certain kind of person and saying, no, I'm not. And while they sit there howling and screaming and saying, yes, you are, you just proved it by saying that you're not, just walk on. That's going to be hard for a lot of people. But then again, it was hard for a lot of people to stop being openly racist. People did a lot of work in the 70s. Now we have more work.
Hmm. There are a few different points I want to get to. One is, and I think this is a very important piece, the way in which this ideology in your analysis, harms Black people, even as it professes to seek to save, or at least, stand up for Black Americans, people of color. I also would be curious to get into sort of the etymology a bit, or at least the history of the evolution of the term racism itself, because that always seems to be, baked into the confusion that we have over this general topic, and who better to comment on that than yourself. But you made a remark I just want to pin really quick about white people, I think, sort of giving in to the social pressure to validate this sort of, emotional, ideological, religious furor. What I want to ask you is it not possible that many white folks, many white allies, just use the phrase, are people who are genuinely sort of learning new things, whether they're reading the 1619 Project, or they're looking at shows like, Dear White People, or watching Vox videos, or various other things online. Is it not possible that you've got many white people who are just learning more than they ever had before about the history of racism in America, the impact of the war on drugs and mass incarceration on African American society, et cetera, who are thinking to themselves, goodness gracious, you know what? Society has benefited me in a disproportionate way compared to these people, at least. Why don't I do the work and put myself forward as somebody who wants to be a part of the solution to these problems? Isn't there a sincere and earnest sort of motivation that can be attributed to a lot of these folks, apart from people merely being intimidated by this movement?
Theoretically, yes. And I think that was happening really from the 1990s on. Here's something that I didn't find myself saying much back then. What used to be called conscious rap, and is now really rap in general, was doing a lot of that job. There were ways that you could be opened up to things. The problem is that this white person you're describing now, who doesn't want to be part of the problem and wants to be enlightened, the question is, what are they learning? And what our supposedly smart people are telling that person now is that what you have to do is acknowledge that Black people have had a hard time, pretend that Black people are this one ageless group of people, such that the Black people you know now are, in some sense, the people who were brought to Virginia. It's like we never die. We are one ageless people, all having undergone these experiences over time. And therefore, to not subject us, for example, to serious competition. A lot of this is about just changing standards. So I'm not going to be part of the problem. And therefore, because Black kids tend to have trouble with standardized tests, we're going to call the tests racist and not have anybody take these tests, and completely change our admissions procedures to schools and pretend that some human beings aren't more scholastically talented than others. Now, the fact that Black kids don't do well on tests is not an indication that Black people are not scholastically talented. There's a specific test problem. But to just throw everything to the winds and pretend that there's no such thing as a gifted child, there should be no gifted programs, as has just happened in New York City. To throw everything to the wind and decide that who gets into Boston Latin is going to be determined by zip code instead of by a test at all. You're not going to test people, or you're going to test only a very small sliver, but really you're going to upend the whole procedure. That is not good for Black people, because you get rid of the test in that one school, there are going to be other tests. And in general, the whole idea that you don't want to submit Black people to cognitive ability tests at all, that's been creeping in for about the past 20 years, but is really crested now. You can't do that and then wonder why Charles Murray writes a book saying that Black people are the stupidest people on earth. It's this incredible kabuki where if anybody questions Black cognitive ability, they're treated as if they need to be put into a little pod and sent to the planet Jupiter. This is just, inhuman to say. But then on the other hand, we have an equally influential group of people who are forever screaming that you shouldn't make a Black kid take a test. That makes no blessed sense, except that the people calling for this are religious. If you say Black kids shouldn't have to take a test because Black kids have trouble on tests, you're that white guy. Call him George. George has learned that he doesn't want to be part of the problem. George is a public school teacher. And so he says, oh, well, yeah, we just shouldn't test those kids at all. I mean, we don't want to be part of the problem. And then we wonder why people think that Black people are dumb. It only makes sense if there's a religion telling us to think only of one thing, which is show that you're not a racist. But that's a really dumbed down prescription for getting past the ills of the past and the present in a complex America.
So you're illustrating an example of the counterproductive impact of this way of thinking on Black people, ironic in its counterproductive quality in the academic context. But I think that you can summon other examples. And I think that I've heard you talk about this in the context of law enforcement, the defund the police movement in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. Go ahead and expand on this larger sort of pattern, because, you know, it seems to me like the moral force of this social justice perspective is one that I tend to deeply resonate with. This larger claim that says that because of both history and contemporaneous factors, African Americans have really got the short end of the stick on a wide range of measures. And I think that a lot of people are moved to want to engage on that level, and yet you're saying that just overwhelmingly, the actual impact of this perspective harms the very people it seeks to help. So draw that out for us just a little bit more.
John, one of the most valuable things I've heard you say actually pretty much expresses this. You were talking about how you were talking to Black men in underserved communities. And you said, do you know anybody who's been killed by a white cop? And you were talking about how few people actually do. So we see these things on the news. Yeah. And what happened to George Floyd was an egregious thing. But what happened to him is now kind of the face of anti-racism. We're supposed to think that it is a major problem in Black existence that a cop might kill you or come close to doing it. And we're supposed to forget about how there's a bias in terms of what you see in the media versus how many people there are in the country, how many states there are in this country, how many cities. And the truth is that that underserved Black man is vastly more likely to be killed by another underserved Black man in his community than by a stray white cop. That is simply fact. We don't even need to get into the fact that the cops kill more white people than Black. That gets into some statistical issues. But the only reason that we pay so much attention to the Derek Chauvins, and I'm glad to see what happened to him, but still, the idea that he is the Black community's main problem, as opposed to what we're not supposed to call Black on Black violence, because most people kill members of their own race, that weird liturgical discussion, that's because of the religion. And so really, the only thing that makes Darren Wilson seem more important than the same Black guy being killed by a similar Black guy is this racism focus. The idea is you must focus on whether you know racism exists. And therefore, something that's less of a problem in the Black community than something else gets much, much more attention. That leaves Black people in the lurch for the very simple reason that you can imagine a Black guy who did not deserve to be killed. And you can imagine the circumstances of his killing by a white cop who fires a gun for, you know, either undertrained or he's a terrible person. Okay, and so there's the body bag, etc. Now imagine the same person, the same gun, the same body bag, the same crying mother, but it's because of some gang turf thing that happened. We're supposed to think that the first thing is more tragic. I don't think the mother feels that way. That's not how people feel in those communities. And yet, for me to say this makes me a contrarian or a Republican or somebody who just doesn't understand because he wears cardigan sweaters and grew up middle class. No, it's because this religion trains us to think so much about racism that we forget that there's something that Black people need much more help with than avoiding stray white cops.
Is it possible that there is something of a class dynamic to this new and powerful cultural narrative that has entered everybody's imaginations that explains a little bit of the thrust of the focus of it on things that may seem to be more symbolic, and so I don't know if you read an essay by this incredibly brilliant young writer named Bertrand Cooper in Current Affairs. It if I'm remembering right, the title is "Who Gets to Make Black Pop Culture," or something to that effect.
I read that. Yeah.
Right. And in the piece, he basically sort of details how it is that, for the longest time, and, right up to now, so much of the entertainment industry's portrayal of African Americans has been the portrayal of poverty and certainly, gang violence and all sorts of things that rest on the experience of poor Black people. But if you look at the pedigree of the folks who are making this content, African Americans, largely, but overwhelmingly well educated and from, middle class and upper class neighborhoods, very different background oftentimes than the people they're portraying. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're making bad movies or dishonest films, but I'm wondering if there's not some dynamic in politics wherein some of the struggles that people have who've sort of made it, but are not entirely fitting into the places where they've made, into the places that they've made it to, that suddenly a focus on things like, microaggressions and privilege in the context of conversation and things that sort of point to cultural frictions are linked in a continuum to the actual reality of poverty and incarceration and the more sort of imperative material deprivations that visit the Black community, that, maybe there is some broader, larger sort of connection between these things, but essentially sorts of puts a movement in place that on the one hand has all of the outrage over historic racism that you would think would go into it without a practical focus on the things that actually help people most on the ground. Is it possible that there's some sort of, positionality, so to speak, with respect to class that's leading to some of this confusion in what matters and what's important with respect to, the condition of Black people in America?
That's an interesting perspective on it. I tend to see it less as class than as education, but of course there's such an overlap. We're taught that to be an educated, maybe woke Black person is to understand the nature of oppression and how intractable it is. We're supposed to think of it with a deep, ingrained pessimism. And so even if you did grow up, doctor, lawyer parents, possibly both of them are African, you grow up and you're going to make a movie. The movie is going to be about somebody who's very poor in Atlanta and having a terrible time, and a cop comes and kills somebody and nothing's ever going to help. You think that that's an enlightened message to put across. And I can't accuse the bright young person who does that of engaging in some sort of poverty porn or something like that. They think that they're putting forth a serious message. But if you pull the camera back and you think about how human groups have triumphed in history, including the Yoruba and Igbo immigrants who are that kid's parents as often as not, or people from Jamaica or Guyana, the idea that you focus on the obstacles and think of the most charismatic thing that you can do as saying why you can only get so far until society turns upside down. Once again, maybe there's some truth in that, but it is extremely utopian. It's a radical proposition. Society must change before any of us can do any better than okay. Or society must change before those of us who haven't done okay can do any better. That's new. And that really does stanch a lot of the creativity of our artists, because it's amazing how improper it's considered to talk about solutions, to talk about how you get past these things. I remember back when I've been writing for over 20 years now, and I remember I was thrown by some responses to some things I wrote back in the aughts, where I would write about how you get, no, that's not what it was. I was writing that African American studies departments ought to at least pay lip service to teaching about how people have triumphed. And not just slave rebellions, but beyond that, what Black people have done right, how Black people have gotten past obstacles. Why would that not be of interest? Why would someone not want to analyze that? You're not supposed to. And somebody was writing, John McWhorter thinks that it's all about him. We don't want to learn about you. We want to learn about Black people. The idea being that I was saying, let's learn about how you be a middle-class Black nerd. I did it. Don't you want to be a middle-class Black nerd who doesn't date much until his late 20s? No, I don't think that that's what people should follow. It's just that we have a much more proactive aspect to our history than we're often told. It wasn't, this is going to be very Bob Woodson, but it wasn't just, slavery to Jim Crow to George Floyd. That won't do, but that's what this kid, this hypothetical kid that we're talking about, learns. It's a problem. Yeah. However, I stress, I'm not mad at those people. I don't think they're, just like Cooper wasn't. They're not doing it on purpose, but it's all they grow up seeing depicted as authentic Blackness. They think they're making a novel statement, but it's an old one, and I'm worried that it's not very productive.
It's interesting, of course, because part of what you sometimes hear from folks who I think come from sort of this anti-racist kind of analytical perspective is that the very propensity of American popular culture to emphasize, sort of the poverty porn sort of dimension of African American life and the endless sorts of, portrayals of slavery over and over and over again is actually a part somehow or another of the sort of patronizing integrationist wing of the white supremacist construct. In Ibram X. Kendi's book, he talks about essentially sort of integrationist racism and segregationist racism, and one being, where you want to get rid of the Black folks, and the other being where you don't want to make the Black folks more white cultured so they can fit in and live up to their potential to be more like white folks and whatnot. But there's this sense sometimes that America is in love with this struggle, with this story of Black suffering. And I sort of pick that up sometimes, and that, when you look at modern filmmaking, I didn't see the Harriet Tubman movie, but my understanding is that she, there's some emphasis on her gunplay, her skill in terms of, being able to be rough and tumble. You've got all sorts of portrayals of Black people asserting themselves much more. On the one hand, it seems to me that there's a bit of an empowerment strain in that sort of portrayal of African Americans that comes out of this cultural ethos. Yet on the other hand, you have straightforward statements from folks like Nicole Hannah-Jones, and then go back to Derek Bell's writing. They basically say there's no hope for the country. Nicole Hannah-Jones said, I don't expect anything I do to ever make a difference, right? I just do it anyway. Sort of a fatalism that sort of, that attends the celebratory sort of, assertion of Black power, I guess, to sort of put it bluntly.
Or powerlessness, right?
Yeah. How do you square those circles? See, to me, it brings me back to the class aspect of this a little bit, because on the one hand, Nicole Hannah-Jones surely has her own success to point to, and not just her own, right? On the other hand, there's this broader pessimism about America possibly ever being any better. You see Ta-Nehisi Coates sort of celebrated by white Americans across the country, and it seems to confuse him sometimes, watching some of his appearances. Are those two things reconcilable, or is there just a fundamental incoherence that you perceive there?
It's not incoherent. And I really think that American discourse would advance if we really took it on as a central meme that any enlightened people knew about, that there's a such thing as the victimization complex in human beings. And notice I didn't say Black people, I said people, yeah. Where you exaggerate the degree of your victimhood, and you get pleasure out of accusing other people of hurting you, and you are closed off to other kinds of explanations, and you derive a sense of significance, a sense of purpose from this role that you've constructed as the victim of somebody else's nefariousness. Because if you are surviving despite this oppression that's being applied to you and your people all the time, then just the fact that you get through the days is a stamp of your strength right there. One way of feeling whole for a person is to exaggerate their victimhood and to be a martyr. Psychologists know about this. They're not often given to talking about it in terms of race because they don't want to get in trouble. But this is a personality type. Black America is encouraged to OD on that frame of mind. And so somebody can say, I don't think things will get any better. But if you're a member of the race about whom you're saying that, what you really mean is things will get no better, which means that me sitting here striving and making effort is a form of heroism in itself. Look at what that person is doing to me, poor me, love me. That's a way of being human in a modern society. That is Black America's problem, or more specifically, it's the Black American intelligentsia's problem. I think it's much less the problem with other Black people, but that's where that comes from, that somebody can be so charismatically defeatist in a way that with any other human being, you'd think, aren't you supposed to be a little more positive in your outlook than that? How is it healthy to be that pessimistic? Ta-Nehisi Coates is the same way. He clearly doesn't like white people. I get it. There's a type of Black person who doesn't. And he just thinks there's no hope. And yet that's celebrated as a kind of charisma in our current climate because the religion is about one thing, showing that racism exists. That's how you show you're a good person. So that means that if you do that articulately, then you're celebrated. And that's where that comes from. I don't think that Ta-Nehisi Coates or Nicole Hannah-Jones are unhappy people. It's just that they have happened upon a particular way that a person can feel good. And I think that Black America in general, especially the more educated you get, tends to fall into that trap.
I heard somebody ask Ta-Nehisi Coates once if he had white friends. And I do remember him answering the question along the lines of saying that he does have white friends. And, I think he even named a few people who he enjoys talking to on the phone and might even hang out with, but that there's sort of a line of intimacy that, beyond which it's difficult for him to cross with somebody who doesn't share his sort of deeper lived experience, if you will. But I get your reason for surfacing that. I think that I see this divide between the Black intelligentsia and Black Americans, broadly speaking. I think in largely sort of similar ways as do you. But if you were to just recalibrate, the pessimism a little bit to where it's no longer cynicism, but it is accurate appraisal of and gratitude for progress, balanced by an understanding of the fact that we really do have deep problems in American society and with respect to African Americans in particular, perhaps being underserved by that society. If you were to just shift that a little bit, I'd be much more sympathetic. I think one of the last times we talked, John, I talked about, sort of these differences in the Black experience. And, it's you go to certain places. I mean, I lived in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts for a certain period of time. You'll run into folks who've never been to the beach in Santa Monica because they're just sort of encased in this artificial kind of, well, I say artificial, but in this constructed environment where it's police officers, underperforming school districts, bureaucrats in the welfare system, and so forth. Their parents and grandparents came from poverty and racism, in the South, lived through the horrors of the civil rights movement, experienced mass incarceration, all of that way past slavery and the Ku Klux Klan and so forth. I can sympathize with Black people who feel like, change and uplift is not widespread enough, not quick enough for us to be satisfied. And if I were to express some appreciation for the woke movement, if you will, it would at least be in the direction of saying that, I think that in the America I grew up in, and even in my own person, being half African American myself, I think that there has been sort of a degree to which many Americans have been blinded to the fact that these Black experiences are real, not Black people like me or like you who may be in closer proximity to white folks, and for whom many white folks may, or people of just a different sort of class and educational status might be inclined to sort of judge all of Black America according to. But then once you get past your John Wood Juniors, your John McWhorters, and, many, millions of Black people have it well, there are millions of others who have been locked out of the American dream in a serious way to this day. Is it possible that, part of the intensity of the woke movement is sort of an effort to correct for that for that lack of awareness, for that lack of understanding the complete picture?
Sure. I am not always convinced that we need to have so much quote unquote awareness. I feel like there's probably enough and about as much as we can expect, but you can always have more. My feeling is definitely not, I'm not Larry Elder. My view is not everybody just needs to go buy themselves some real estate and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. That is not my point. My point is that there is a segment of the Black community, I would venture that it's about a quarter, that need help. I think the idea that a middle class or an affluent Black person walks around, shattered by endless microaggressions and in endless danger of being jumped by the cops, I think that's a fantasy, just like gangster rap was. It's absurd. But there are people who really do need help. And in the book at the end, I talk about it, not even at the end, it's before the end, where I lay out what my three-part plan is. And a lot of the three-part plan is end the war on drugs to make life better for Black people who live in underserved communities. These are real problems. My issue is that we spend too much time exaggerating, for example, about what life is like for you and me. And we spend too little time thinking about what life is really like for the people in those communities and what would solve their problems. Defund the police. They don't want that. So why do we even talk about it? That sort of thing. And so, yeah, we need to change our strategies in various ways to help people who really need help. And that genuinely interests me. I would not tell the person who grows up in the inner city, oh, just get over it. No, it's all you ever knew. You never went to the beach. You're not just going to get over it. You need help. It should be like the barbershop. That almost sounds like a cliche, but it's the barbershop. Those guys at the barbershop know that there's racism. They will tell you, Mike Brown, they'll say that. I disagree with their view of Mike Brown, but I've heard Mike Brown discussed as like just basically shut up evidence that, America's all about racism. But then in the next breath, they'll talk about how we don't do enough to make things better for ourselves. And to the extent that that's true, I think it's because it percolates into the Black community, a general message that our problems are all white people's fault and they're not going to change until white people all get up and realize something. We need a new Martin Luther King. That's never going to happen. I'm with the barbershop. There is racism, but there are things we could do if it was considered normal for us to really think about them. That's all. That's all we need. Indeed.
Well, thank you for ending us on that constructive note, John. And once again, I'm hoping we can continue the conversation into the future. The book is.
We will.
Thank you very much, sir. And the book is Woke Racism. John, when can people get it, and how can they follow your work?
Woke Racism is dropping on October 26th. You can listen to me being a linguist on Lexicon Valley at booksmart.com. And you can read me writing about all sorts of things every 3 days at the New York Times.
Absolutely. Fantastic. John, thank you so much for being on. And for folks who are interested in the mission, in the work of Braver Angels, building a house united by creating bridges of goodwill across left and right, Black and white and beyond, join us. You can become a member at braverangels.org. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. As ever, we are building a house united. Until next time.